Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something, well, pretty complex, definitely deeply strategic. We're diving into source material that lays out Pakistan's whole journey to getting nuclear capability.
Okay.
And it's a story that spans decades, but importantly, our analysis frames it not just, as a national science project, but as the deliberate creation of what the sources are calling Islamic deterrence.
That's right. We're trying to get beyond just the usual headlines, the geopolitics of it all, and really focus on the specifics, the history, the motivations, and the philosophy behind this whole narrative. Because the sources we're looking at, they portray Pakistan's nuclear program as this decisive moment. The moment the nation basically secured its role, as they put it, as the strategic shield of the Ummah.
That phrase, Ummah shield, it really jumps out, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And it tells you straight away, this isn't just about physics or national defense in the narrow sense. So our mission here really is to unpack that high-stakes story presented in the material. It's a narrative that claims Pakistan took, decades of scientific work, strategic necessity, and kind of fused it all together, turning, as they say, the atom into armor, the laboratory into liberty, and faith into fusion. Quite poetic, actually.
It is. And to really get what that transformation means, we need to go back to the beginning, right? The 1950s.
Exactly. You have to understand the global picture then. Nuclear science. It was seen pretty unequivocally as a Western thing, a monopoly, really. And the sources we have really emphasize that even when other nations, including Muslim nations, got involved in those early global nuclear programs, it wasn't equal footing. Not at all.
Okay, so unequal from the start. That sets the stage for, well, pretty much everything that follows. Right, let's unpack that imbalance. It starts, according to the sources, with President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program back in the 50s.
Launched 53. The idea, on the surface, was sharing nuclear tech for peaceful stuff, energy, medicine, that kind of thing.
Sounds good on paper.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a core tension there.
Yeah. The tension, and this is what the historical analysis really picks up on, was the gap between access and equality. Big difference. So non-nuclear states, Pakistan included, they got access to some basic tech, some training, but crucially, not the knowledge needed for weapons. Things like, uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing that was kept locked down.
So it was like being invited into the physics classroom, but the door to the military lab was firmly shut.
That's a good way to put it. It was very structured imbalance. Countries like Pakistan, they were participating, sure, but more like spectators, doing basic research, maybe building a power plant. They weren't really partners in controlling the core knowledge. They were consuming the output, not challenging the monopoly itself.
So they learned some science, they got a foot in the door, but strategically they were still vulnerable, still dependent on the West for fuel, for the advanced bits.
Absolutely. The limitations were systemic, based on the analysis. The reactors they might get, usually low-power research types or light water power plants, and the fuel for those was super controlled under strict international safeguards, which basically meant making weapons-grade material was designed to be impossible, or at least extremely difficult and detectable.
Right.
The real power, closing the fuel cycle, enrichment, reprocessing that stayed firmly with the existing nuclear powers.
It sounds like a very clever way to manage technological spread, keeping control.
Yeah.
But this experience, even just being spectators, it planted a seed, didn't it, according to the sources?
Oh, absolutely. A crucial one. The big insight Pakistan took away from that time was about the future. True independence, they realized, wasn't just about having power plants. It was about having technological parity. Knowledge was the key. So you see this initial commitment, an intellectual one, to nuclear science, setting up institutes and so on, way before the immediate strategic threat really kicked in.
That's interesting. So the drive in the 60s wasn't immediately about defense, but more about understanding that future global power would hinge on mastering the most advanced science.
That's the argument presented. Build the foundation, the scientific base, the human capital. Prepare intellectually.
And that preparation turned out to be critical when the strategic game suddenly changed.
Exactly. Because when the political decision was eventually made, much later, to go for the bomb, they weren't starting completely from scratch. They had scientists, engineers, institutions already in place. Atoms for Peace, ironically, had taught them enough to know what they didn't know and what they absolutely had to get their hands on.
Okay, so the story really picks up pace here. The event that shattered that, let's say, peacetime scientific focus was India's nuclear test in 1974, codenamed Smiling Buddha.
A seismic event. The sources argue this just completely redefined everything in South Asia, irrevocably.
And there was an element of, well, perceived deception involved.
Yes, the sources focus heavily on that. India called it a peaceful nuclear explosion, a PNE. But they used material produced in a reactor that Canada had supplied, under the Atoms for Peace banner. So, from Pakistan's perspective, this looked like a huge betrayal of that initial promise. India had used the slogan Atoms for Peace to secretly build atoms for power. That's the narrative.
And this happened relatively soon after the 1971 war, which saw East Pakistan become Bangladesh. The timing must have felt existential.
Absolutely devastating. It created this immense crisis for Pakistan's leadership under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The test wasn't just seen as a rival getting the bomb. It felt like the final strategic checkmate after the conventional military defeat in 71.
What about the world's reaction? The sources often point to this as being almost as important as the test itself for Pakistan's next move.
Right. What did the international community do? The analysis suggests the lesson Pakistan learned was stark, maybe even cynical. Global powers, especially the ones who supplied India initially, mostly just wrung their hands diplomatically. Some weak sanctions maybe, but they faded pretty quickly.
So the message received was,
Brutal and simple, according to the source material. Those who cannot defend themselves will never be treated as equals. International norms, security guarantees, they seemed secondary to the hard reality of power.
that silence, that perceived failure of the nonproliferation system to act decisively, must have solidified the feeling that they were on their own.
Exactly. It wasn't just seen as an external failure, but a failure of the whole global system they'd been participating in, however unequally. This event, more than any other, arguably defined South Asia's path forward. It forced Pakistan into an immediate strategic counterreaction. Relying on others wasn't an option anymore. Deterrence had to be homegrown.
And this led directly to that famous, very dramatic declaration from Bhutto.
Yes, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. His commitment is really highlighted as the turning point. Remember, Pakistan was in dire economic straits after the 71 war, so when he said, if India builds the bomb, we will eat grass, but we will build our own, that wasn't just talk, it was a signal internally and externally.
A signal that survival, strategic security now trumped everything else. Economic comfort, international opinion, whatever.
Precisely, it signaled absolute national resolve. The pursuit of the bomb became an existential necessity, regardless of the cost, regardless of the isolation it would bring. The political green light was now absolute. #, secret steps, and key players in the atomic journey.
Okay, so the political will is absolute. Now, the immense challenge, turning that resolve into a functioning weapon secretly. The sources mentioned the foundations were already there, Pinstek, Ganupi. What exactly were their roles?
Right. These places, built during that earlier Atoms for Peace time, became the engine room. Pinstek Pakistan Institute of Nuclear Science and Technology, that was the core R&D hub. The physics brains, the analysis. And KNUPP, the Karachi nuclear power plant, was also vital. Even though it was for power, it gave them real hands-on experience. Managing a reactor, understanding neutronics, handling radioactive materials safely. Practical stuff.
So theory from Pinstek, practice from KNUP.
Sort of, yeah. And you had key figures leading the way initially. People like Dr. Ishfaq Ahmad and even Nobel laureate Dr. Abdus Salam in the very early stages. The sources note Dr. Salam's involvement in the 60s, laying some groundwork, providing that initial scientific credibility, even though the program later became highly secret and militarized, and his involvement changed.
But the real breakthrough, the key to actually building a bomb, seems to hinge on one particular person returning after 74.
Yes, Dr. A.Q. Khan. His return from Europe is consistently highlighted in the sources as pivotal, absolutely crucial.
Why specifically him? What did he bring?
He's credited with bringing the know-how, specifically the blueprints, the technical details, the process knowledge for the gas centrifuge method of uranium enrichment. This was key because it let Pakistan sidestep the route India took, which involved a large reactor and reprocessing things that are harder to hide. Khan brought the alternative path.
Okay, let's pause there. Uranium enrichment capability. Can you break that down for us? Why was the centrifuge method such a game changer, especially for a country trying to do this secretly?
Sure. So natural uranium mostly contains the U-238 isotope, which isn't fissile, meaning it won't sustain a chain reaction easily. Only a tiny fraction, less than 1%, is the U-235 isotope you need for a bomb. Enrichment is the process of increasing that U-235 concentration, usually up to 90% or more for weapons grade, and it's incredibly difficult technologically.
Okay, and centrifuges.
Think of them as very high-speed spinning cylinders. You feed uranium gas into them, and the slight weight difference between U-238 and U-235 allows you to separate them. The lighter U-235 collects closer to the center. You link thousands of these centrifuges together in cascades to gradually increase increase the enrichment level.
And why was this better for secrecy?
Well, as the analysis points out, centrifuges are physically smaller than reactors or big reprocessing plants. You can hide a centrifuge facility more easily. They don't have the same massive infrastructure signature. And crucially, the parts, the specialized rotors, magnets, casings could often be sourced piece by piece, maybe disguised as components for other industries. Through complex international networks, you avoid the big, obvious shipments needed for a reactor program.
Sneakier, essentially.
Much harder to track, especially in the pre-internet era. And the sources emphasize that Pakistan managed to develop this capability secretly in about a decade after the decision was made.
A decade. For a country facing sanctions, under scrutiny, working in secret, that seems incredibly fast for such complex tech.
It really is striking. And the sources make a point of saying the world basically got it wrong. They underestimated Pakistan.
Underestimated what exactly?
Their unity, their scientific talent, and what the sources called their moral determination. Outsiders thought the money problems, the tech hurdles, the sanctions, it would all be too much for a developing nation to overcome alone in that time frame.
Which brings us to that interesting economic point the sources make. Resource scarcity doesn't stop purpose-driven innovation. How did lack of resources actually drive innovation here?
It's that classic necessity is the mother of invention idea, but on a national scale. Because they couldn't just go out and buy the specialized gear off the shelf legally.
They had to improvise.
Exactly. They had to reverse engineer things. They had to figure out how to make complex components, like specialized valves or magnets for the centrifuges, in their own workshops. Sometimes, the sources say, they repurposed parts from completely different civilian machines. The lack of resources forced them to find clever workarounds, develop local manufacturing skills for highly specific items, rather than just giving up. That sheer commitment, that purpose, helped them leapfrog the obstacles.
And that ingenuity, that commitment, was definitely put to the test through the 80s and 90s. This wasn't a smooth ride at all. The sources paint a picture of intense secrecy, constant pressure, Western embargoes.
Oh, absolutely. Those decades were defined by pressure. Once the centrifuge program started coming to light, the U.S., for instance, brought in things like the Pressler Amendment, the Glenn Amendment laws, specifically designed to cut off aid, military and economic, to pressure Pakistan into stopping.
Trying to starve the program financially.
Essentially, yes. Restricting financial transactions, blocking access to dual-use technologies, things that have both civilian and military applications. It was a concerted effort to isolate Pakistan and break its resolve. And so the whole operation had to go even deeper underground. Maximum secrecy became paramount to dodge foreign intelligence.
And the sources mention the geography of it, from Chagai Mountains to Kahuta Labs.
Right, it spanned the country. Kahuta Research Laboratories near Islamabad, that was the heart of the enrichment effort, heavily guarded. But other parts of the program, potential test preparations, were happening elsewhere, like in the remote mountains of Chagai in Balochistan. It was a hidden national network.
Now, the sources shift here, beyond just the tech and the politics to the human side.
Yeah.
You said it sounded less like a typical government project and more like a national cause, almost an underground movement.
It really does come across that way. And this is where the source material gets quite compelling, I think, focusing on the sheer sacrifice involved over decades. It wasn't just about government funding. It was about people enduring hardship for the cause. The narrative is explicit. The nuclear dream, as they call it, was sustained by collective belief, not budget.
Can you give some of those specific examples of sacrifice? They make it very real.
Yeah, the sources list quite a few to show how deep the commitment went. They talk about scientists working for little or no pay, driven purely by the mission, sometimes living for ages at remote sites away from families. Engineers literally reusing spare parts, cannibalizing bits from old machines to keep these incredibly sensitive centrifuges spinning. That's innovation born of scarcity right there.
Amazing.
Even down to the soldiers guarding the labs. The sources mention them sometimes going without proper uniforms, prioritizing secrecy, and blending in over standard military procedure just to avoid drawing attention.
It paints a picture of incredible dedication, almost zealotry.
Which leads to that powerful, almost spiritual conclusion the sources draw. Faith became fuel. It reframes the entire program as a kind of moral quest, driven by something intangible, something beyond GDP or industrial might.
So the belief that this was essential for national survival, maybe even for the broader Muslim world, that's what kept it going through decades of hardship and isolation.
That's precisely the interpretation offered. That moral determination, that collective belief system was the ultimate resource. the resource the outside world didn't factor into its calculations when it assumed Pakistan couldn't possibly succeed.
It's a powerful narrative. But surely the sources must acknowledge the controversies. The international concerns about proliferation, the AQ Khan network, later on the huge ethical weight of developing these weapons. Is that discussed?
Honestly, the source material we're focusing on here frames it almost entirely through the lens of necessity and self-defense. It was a response, they argue, to an existential threat posed by India. International criticism, proliferation concerns, these are generally portrayed as, well, predictable reactions from the powers who wanted to maintain the nuclear monopoly. The focus stays firmly on the moral necessity of achieving self-reliance and balancing regional power. Acquiring the technology in this narrative is depicted as a patriotic duty, not an ethical lapse.
So all that secrecy, sacrifice, determination, it all builds towards May 1998. India conducts 5 nuclear tests. The pressure on Pakistan to respond must have been immense.
Unbelievable pressure, internally and externally. After decades of clandestine work, this was the moment. They had to show they had a credible deterrent. Any ambiguity had to be removed.
And they responded decisively.
They did. May 28, 1998. The Chagai tests. The sources confirm Pakistan conducted 6 tests in total over those few days.
6 tests. Why so many? Not just one for one with India.
It wasn't just about matching India tit for tat. Conducting multiple tests served a crucial technical purpose. It allowed them to test different warhead designs, verify yields, demonstrate the reliability of their systems. It was a clear signal. We don't just have a bomb, we have a reliable, deliverable arsenal. It removed any lingering doubt about their capability and their political will to use it if necessary.
And the sources use very striking imagery to describe the tests themselves.
Yeah.
The mountains in Balochistan turning white.
Yes, that image, the Chagai Hills turning white from the blast, is used very symbolically in the material. It's presented almost like this moment of purification. Purity, as in the nation had finally purged its strategic vulnerability, achieved independence, and power, obviously the ultimate deterrent. It's framed as a moment of national vindication, almost redemption, achieved through all that prior sacrifice and scientific effort.
What was the immediate result? According to the sources, how did this change things?
The stated result was immediate and profound. 2 key things. First, on a regional level, the strategic balance in South Asia shifted dramatically. It went from a situation where India had clear nuclear dominance back to a state of mutual deterrence. Scary, maybe, but stable in a grim sort of way.
Okay, restoring the regional balance. What was the second thing?
The second, much broader claim was that for the first time, the Muslim world possessed credible nuclear deterrence. This wasn't just Pakistan becoming the world's 7th declared nuclear state. It was something bigger in this narrative. It elevated the program beyond national defense. The sources explicitly state that Pakistan became the strategic shield of the Ummah. That's a huge claim, positioning its nuclear capability as a pan-Islamic asset.
Write that phrase again, strategic shield of the Ummah. This leads us directly into the philosophy, the doctrine, that the sources say underpins Pakistan's nuclear posture. They call it the doctrine of Islamic deterrence. How is that defined? Is it different from standard deterrence theory?
It's presented as having a distinct emphasis. The core definition offered is deterrence based on protection by principle, explicitly not aggression. That distinction is heavily stressed. The idea is that the arsenal exists purely defensively. It's an assertion of sovereignty designed fundamentally to prevent war by making the cost of attacking Pakistan, or potentially its allies, unacceptably high.
So it's not a weapon for destruction, but a guarantor of peace.
That's the framing, a guarantor of peace through justice. The argument embedded here is that real peace is only possible when the potentially vulnerable are strong enough to resist coercion. Therefore, possessing this strength is positioned as a moral imperative, especially in a volatile neighborhood.
And this moral dimension, this idea of strength being a duty, is linked directly to religious texts in the source material.
Yes, very explicitly. The philosophy is anchored to a specific Quranic verse cited in the analysis, Surah 8, verse 60. And prepare against them whatever you can of power. The interpretation provided is that developing defensive strength, even overwhelming strength, isn't just permissible. It's actually an obligation, a principled duty to deter aggression, protect the community, and ultimately uphold justice and peace. Military readiness becomes framed as a religious requirement.
Okay, so it's a defensive doctrine rooted in principle and religious interpretation. How does this then extend beyond Pakistan's own borders to become this Ummah shield? What's the mechanism for that?
This forms the conceptual core of what the sources call the nuclear umbrella. It's a framework where Pakistan's nuclear power, underpinned by this doctrine, is seen to protect not just Pakistan, but potentially all Muslim lands.
How does that work in practice? Are they suggesting deploying weapons elsewhere?
Not necessarily direct deployment, according to the analysis. It's more about the deterrent credibility that Pakistan now possesses. The idea seems to be that a major strategic attack on a key Muslim nation could destabilize the entire region in a way that inevitably involves Pakistan's strategic interests. So Pakistan's nuclear capability creates a kind of strategic overhang, a protective layer that gives other Muslim states in the region greater strategic autonomy and security simply by its existence. It discourages major aggression against them because of the potential for escalation involving Pakistan.
So the doctor basically says an attack on one, particularly a significant one, might be considered a threat to the balance we maintain. It turns the wider religious community into a kind of extended strategic interest.
That's a good way to summarize the concept presented. It operationalizes the Ummah Shield idea, making the security of the broader community a factor in Pakistan's own strategic calculations. It's a very different way of thinking about deterrence compared to purely national models.
Which brings us right up to the present, or near present, in the analysis. The theory of this nuclear umbrella, this Islamic deterrence, is then shown becoming concrete policy. Specifically, the sources point to a 2025 Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact. How significant is this pact viewed within this framework?
It's presented as highly significant. The sources explicitly frame this 2025 pact as the strategic extension of Pakistan's nuclear credibility. This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. It's seen as taking that abstract idea of the Ummah Shield and formalizing it through a concrete geopolitical agreement with a major regional partner. It's Pakistan demonstrating a willingness to link its strategic weight to Saudi Arabia's defense.
Okay, but what does extending nuclear credibility actually mean in practice through this pact? Is it an explicit nuclear guarantee like NATO's Article 5 or something different?
The analysis suggests it's perhaps a bit more nuanced than a simple NATO-style guarantee, but still very potent. The sources don't detail specific WMD clauses, naturally, but they imply a very deep level of defense cooperation. We're talking about things like joint military exercises that incorporate strategic-level planning, extensive intelligence sharing on regional threats, mutual defense funding commitments, logistics sharing arrangements for crises. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership.
So less about stationing weapons, more about integrating defense planning at the highest levels.
Exactly. And the key is the signal it sends. By entering this pact, Pakistan is effectively saying that Saudi Arabia's security and the stability of the Gulf region is now inextricably linked to the strategic balance that Pakistan's own deterrent underpins. This gives Saudi Arabia a huge economic power, but not a nuclear one, a significant layer of strategic reassurance without needing to pursue its own nuclear weapons program, which would be incredibly destabilizing.
The sources use some very specific, almost loaded language to describe this partnership. They talk about a union of sacred and strategic sovereignty. What's the implication of pairing those two ideas?
It implies this powerful convergence of two forms of legitimacy. Saudi Arabia is described, of course, as the custodian of Islam's two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina. That gives it immense sacred religious authority in the Muslim world. Simultaneously, Pakistan is positioned as the custodian of nuclear faith, the possessor of the strategic shield, the military and technological might.
So putting them together
Creates, in this narrative, a unique union, sacred and strategic sovereignty united. This combination is meant to project immense strengths and authority across the entire Ummah. It validates the claim that Pakistan's nuclear assets serve a purpose far beyond its own borders. Its collective security endorsed by both religious legitimacy and military power.
It sounds like it's presented as more than just a standard military alliance.
Yeah.
It's framed as a foundational alignment for regional power and security within the Muslim world.
Precisely. And the ultimate conclusion drawn in the source material we reviewed is that this pact demonstrates that the vision of a Muslim deterrence shield isn't just aspirational theory anymore. By 2025, it's policy in action. It serves as the final validation in this narrative of Pakistan's entire nuclear journey, arguing it was always aimed at this broader goal of collective security and has now reshaped the strategic reality. #outro.
Wow. That really has been quite a journey we've traced based on the sources.
Mm-hmm.
It's starting way back in the 50s with that unequal atoms for peace dynamic, moving through the shock of '74, the decades of secret work, the immense national sacrifice under sanctions,
Right.
culminating in the '98 tests and then this formal strategic framework. exemplified by the 2025 Pact. The whole narrative arc is really defined by that shift, isn't it? From seeking atoms for peace to ultimately achieving atoms for protection, hard-won protection.
Absolutely. And that shift, that whole story, is underpinned by the source's final thought, something we really need to grapple with when thinking about regional stability. That this capability wasn't seen, internally at least, as Pakistan's revenge. Instead, it was framed as its responsibility, a duty they felt compelled to undertake due to strategic circumstances, and then defined by principle. The hand that built the bomb, in this view, built balance and a shield.
So if we take that idea seriously, the strategic shield of the Ummah, formalized somewhat by the 2025 Pact, it really does change how we think about strategic power.
It does, and it leaves us, and you, the listener, with a complex question to mull over. When a nuclear power defines its deterrent capability not just nationally, but in terms of protecting a wider religious or cultural community,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean for the choices facing other nations within that community?
Right.
Does this concept of collective security, defined by faith and strategic extension, fundamentally change the risk calculations for, say, non-nuclear Muslim-majority states? How does it interact with, or maybe even challenge, traditional geopolitical alliances like NATO or others? It adds a whole new layer to global strategic thinking.